All righty. So now I am going to start. This is my presentation on Mount Soledad, and Soledad is Spanish for solitude. And I did want to welcome everybody and let you know a little bit about why I chose this subject of Mount Soledad. First of all, we just had Memorial Day recently, and that was in my mind. And I visit Mount Soledad on my tours quite often, and I like to go around and point out the different plaques. And people say, wow, Keri, you really know where a lot of these plaques are. And anyway, I decided that I would show all of you how many plaques are up there. Of course, I can't show you all 5,500 of them, but I will show some of people you may have heard of in the past and some that you may have never heard of. But all of them have a story. All of them served our country, and we thank all of them. So I will move on here. Just for those of you that are not from San Diego, to show you the location of where Mount Soledad is. It sits close to 10 miles north of downtown San Diego, and it's right over there by the ocean. And then getting a little closer there, you can see it's pretty close to Interstate 5, and then you've got La Jolla Cove just nearby as well. And then this is a great drone view of it all. You can see Point Loma and the Pacific Ocean. From there, you can also see east to the Laguna Mountains. And on a clear day, you can see San Clemente and Catalina Island. Mount Soledad National Veterans Memorial is a memorial that's dedicated to all who have served in the military. And as long as one has not been dishonorably discharged, they are allowed to get a plaque up here. All 5 branches of the military are represented here: the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and Air Force, as well as the Merchant Marines during World War II. One can be alive to get a plaque, so that is something that people don't realize here. And in fact, they say it's easier to get the information needed when the veteran is alive. The plaques don't necessarily have dates on them of, when the person served or, when they lived, when they died, if they died. Really, it's just the ones that were killed in action that have dates that I have found. There is a form that needs to be filled out if you wanted to get a plaque up here, and at the end of this presentation I'll have the information there for you. It's called a DD-214, and then it also costs money. The price is $950 to $1,800. The criteria has changed over the years for Mount Soledad. First, it was just to honor those who had fought in the Korean War, and then it expanded to those who had lost their lives in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. And then later they changed it to those who had fought in times of conflict or war. And then finally, their final mission was to honor anyone who has served in the military. This is a timeline of the cross, and I've written it down. I'll try to be as quick as possible with this, but those of you that live here in San Diego know that we've gone through quite a bit with this cross. It was, back in 1899 on that hill, they put up an old signal station, and people would go up there just as we do now to look at sunsets or, just have some solitude there at Mount Soledad. But in 1908, it was recorded that they had hundreds of people go to the top there to see the Great White Fleet go by. And that was the armada of US battleships that was sent out by Theodore Roosevelt to do a worldwide tour to show Navy power. Also, a couple of years later, there was a big group that went up there to see Halley's Comet, just like we would do now. 1913 is when they put up the first cross, and that was a redwood cross, and they figured that it was maybe not even in that point, maybe a little bit farther south. Also that year is when they built a 4-mile road that came up from an area close by called Pacific Beach. In 1916, they improved the road, they realigned it, and Kate Sessions, who is a woman that helped to landscape Balboa Park and the Hotel del Coronado, she came up with 60 of her members of the San Diego Floral Association and 12 automobiles, and they planted trees. In fact, 5 of those trees were Torrey pine trees, and we still have those today. In 1916, they also agreed, they being the San Diego City Council, to make this area, Mount Soledad and the south 120 acres, a city park. The cross itself now sits on about a half an acre of land. 1923 is when the cross was stolen. They built another road in 1926, and then in 1929 is when they had their first Easter sunrise service, and they had them every year since then. And they erected kind of a temporary cross. They had over 1,000 people show up, and to this day, about 1,000 people show up every time they have an Easter sunrise service. This is the first year in a long time we haven't had one. 1934 is when a more permanent cross went up. It was a wood cross that was kind of covered with chicken wire and stucco. And they had that until 1952 when it blew down. And it had been weathered, and it had, BB gun holes all in it. And so it was time to build a new one. But also in 1952, that same year, is when the idea for a memorial was conceived by the American Legion Post of La Jolla. And it was to honor veterans of the Korean War. And that's when the Mount Soledad Memorial Association was incorporated. 1954 is when they put up the cross that you see in the background there. It's a 42-foot concrete cross made of 20 tons of concrete, that they laid a form out on the ground, and they allowed it to cure for 60 days. It was also at that time that they changed the purpose of the cross, and they kind of dedicated it to military who had died in both World Wars and the Korean War. Then we kind of skipped to 1989, which is when the lawsuits started to begin. They were started by a Vietnam War veteran who was an atheist, and he did not like that there was a religious symbol on public property. He said it was a direct violation of the Constitution. The litigation covered more than 27 years with several court rulings, 2 aborted sales. They almost took the cross down at one point. They had a property transfer from the city of San Diego to the Department of Defense, and the case went up and down in the court system and all the way to the US Supreme Court on 2 occasions. So during those 27 years, in 2000 is when we put up the first walls that make what we see now the Mount Soledad National Veterans Memorial. But they erected 6 walls for room for 3,500 of these plaques, and they changed again the criteria to honor those who served in times of conflict and war. 2006 is when the US Department of Defense took it over. In 2012 is when they added some more walls, and they've even added more since then. And that's when they opened it up to all branches of service and anybody who had served in the military. 2014, an act of Congress allowed it to be transferred to private ownership. 2015, it was sold to the Mount Soledad Memorial Association by the US Department of Defense. And it was sold with a proviso that the half-acre parcel of land that the cross sits on is maintained as a veterans memorial forever. 2016, it officially became Mount Soledad National Veterans Memorial, and the courts ruled that since the cross no longer stood on public property, it could not be removed. So that is the 27 years in a nutshell. But I know that those of you that live in San Diego, it just seemed to drag on forever and ever. This is a Torrey pine, one of the original that Kate Sessions planted up there. It is considered the rarest pine tree in the United States. This is a great picture I took recently of the Mount Soledad National Veterans Memorial, and you can see all of the plaques. There just is so many. They've got over 5,500 now, so this just gives you an idea of how many there are, and they're not in any particular order at all. They're not chronological, they're not by branch, they're not by war, they're not by status. Everybody is considered equal here. They all served our country. This is a layout of the plaques and the walls. So the original walls would have been walls A, B, C, D, E, and F. And if you look right here, there's a little blue box, and that has a little book there that has a list of everybody there. So you can go up there and find people by looking through that book, which is very helpful. And the other thing about this is it is very unique in that it is the only memorial here in the United States that honors veterans living or deceased with an image of the veteran. The granite that they use is the same granite that was used on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. But it's just so nice. You can go and you can touch it and just be a part of it. I wanted to show one of the docents here. This is Dick Lester. He was a former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. And there are many, many docents. Every single day there is somebody up there willing to help you learn about Mount Soledad. Not all of them have a plaque, but he has a plaque. Dick has one. It's right there. So he was talking about it that day. And now I'm going to just talk about a few of the plaques here. So I'm doing it a little bit chronological or by status. So this is Drury Bailey. They called him Drew, and he was in the Confederate Army of the Civil War. And when he joined in 1862, he received $50 for his signature and $200 more for using his own horse. After the war, he and his cousins, the Julians, decided to move to San Diego. They brought their horses with them. That was part of the deal when the Confederates surrendered. And in 1869, he and his cousins claimed and platted the mining camp town that became known as Julian City. That was the same year in 1869 that Fred Coleman discovered gold in the area. And it was named for Mike Julian because they figured that was a nicer name than Bailey. So they went with Julian, but Julian's known for its apple pies. This right here is a great story. This is Charles Wendell Fenton, and he attended West Point and then became a cavalry officer in the days of the Indian Wars. He was promoted to captain in 1901, and he's actually buried at Arlington Cemetery. But in 2008, so fast track to 2008, a 107-year-old document came to the post office of Fort Meade, South Dakota. Now, Fort Meade was the headquarters of the United States 7th Cavalry. And anyway, there's something showing up there. Maybe that's mine. Anyway, sorry about that. So anyway, it just mysteriously showed up at this post office, and it turns out that it was a proclamation signed by President William McKinley promoting Fenton to the rank of captain in the U.S. Army. And so he had never received it, even though he had been made captain. And his family didn't even realize that he was a captain. But somebody wrote an article about this mysterious document that all of a sudden showed up, and somebody took it upon themselves to track down the family. They were able to track down his grandson in Maine and give him the document that was a proclamation signed by President McKinley that promoted Fenton to the rank of captain. So that's a pretty neat little story. Also trivia for Fort Meade, which is near Sturgis in South Dakota. It's the birthplace of the custom of playing the Star-Spangled Banner at military functions. And that began in the early 1900s. And after it was publicized in the early years of the 1900s, President Woodrow Wilson made it mandatory in 1916. And then Congress designated it as our national anthem in 1931. Now I'm going to go with some of the generals here. This is John Joseph Blackjack Pershing. And again, I want to just mention that the people that have their plaques up here, these were either purchased by somebody in their family or an association or friends or a fan club. So not every single person has a plaque up here. If they did, this place would be completely filled up. But anyway, so we don't have all the generals here. But John Joseph Blackjack Pershing, he was a general of the armies of the United States, and he was the only officer ever to be granted that position, and it's above the 5-star grade. So he was for the U.S. Army, and he has a big background there. He was West Point class of '86, and then instructed there in '97. And he was chief of staff, and he was in the Indian Wars, Spanish American, Philippine American, Russo, Japanese, Mexican expedition, and World War I. That man served for a long time. Interesting story is that in 1905, President Teddy Roosevelt used his presidential powers and actually nominated Pershing as a brigadier general. And the Congress approved that. So you think, well, what's different about that? Well, it skipped him 3 ranks and more than 835 officers that were senior to him. So the promotion really got people thinking, was it more of a political connection, more so than his military abilities? But yep, he bypassed 835 officers. And then we have George Patton. He's kind of a local. He was born and raised in Pasadena, California, but he was a 4-star general in the U.S. Army in World War I and World War II. He got a Purple Heart. There's a museum named for him at Chiriaco Summit, which is near Indio, California. I've been there a few times with my tour company, Day Tripper Tours, that I work for. But in World War II, Patton was made a senior commander of a newly devised United States Tank Corps. And he was told he needed to find an appropriate place to do some desert training. And so he found this place called Chiriaco Summit, which is near Indio. And the site was donated by Joseph Chiriaco, one of the residents there that owned most of that land. But anyway, 18,000 square miles of Mojave and Colorado desert. So basically the entire southeast corner of California and Arizona. And they trained over 1 million troops, and they used that area until 1944. And it was really just so the troops would be prepared for the harsh desert conditions of the Sahara in northern Africa. The first troops that arrived there called it the place that God forgot. He was only there for about 4 months, and then he was summoned to go overseas and plan Operation Torch. In 1945, he was in a car crash. Unfortunately, it broke his neck and he died just 12 days later. Just a little bit about him. He was a prolific writer, even though he had dyslexia. And they didn't know he had dyslexia at the time because that was something that had only been identified about 11 years before he went to school. And he was unable to read or write, but he had people that read to him all the time, and he was able to quote from memory lengthy Bible passages and volumes of poetry and long passages of history. So he knew what he was talking about. But dyslexia actually didn't become recognized really until the 1920s. He was also an Olympic athlete. And when he was 26, he competed in the first ever Olympic modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics. And he finished 5th, and he said he would have finished better, but there was a little controversy in the pistol shooting event because the judges said he missed the target on one of his shots, and he said, I did not. I am such a good shot that one of my bullets went through one of the other bullet holes, but they didn't believe him. He also believed in reincarnation. So Patton claimed that he had been in the Romanian legionnaire and as part of the 14th century army of John the Blind of Bohemia. So I gotta hold on one second. I have somebody who's mute everybody again. All right. Anyway, and then he believes also that after he died that he would once again return to be in battle. His maternal grandfather was Benjamin Wilson, the mayor of Los Angeles at one time. And those of you that live around Los Angeles, was Mount Wilson, the San Gabriel Mountains is named in his honor. So somebody has raised their hand, but I'm not able to see that right now. So, all right, let's continue on. And then here's another one of the admirals here, Bill, or Bull Halsey as he was called. He was a fleet admiral, and his slogan was hit hard, hit fast, and hit often. And he played an important role in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was the largest naval battle of the war there. And he also took part of the Great White Fleet that cruised by Mount Soledad back in 1908. And then this was his photographer. So he had somebody that photographed everything that he did, and that was it. He was a native Cherokee. We have Ulysses S. Grant. Now I'm moving a little bit into the presidents. And he, of course, was also a general during the Mexican-American War, the Union Army, the Civil War. And he was also a 3-star lieutenant general with command of all Union forces. Interesting about him is that he was born Hiram Ulysses Grant, and he didn't like those initials HUG, H-U-G. So when he attended West Point and put his name down, he put it down as Ulysses S. Grant, and Simpson was his mother's maiden name. But he was, as you know, did everything in the military, but he is most known because he was the one that General Lee surrendered to during the Civil War on April 9th of 1865. Ulysses Grant was also supposed to be at Ford's Theater the night that Abraham Lincoln was shot, but he had to miss it. He was not in town. And I have a little picture there of his tomb. So he's buried over there in a 150-foot high tomb that's located in Morningside Heights neighborhood of Upper Manhattan in New York City. It's the largest mausoleum in North America. His family, his son, came and lived in San Diego and built the U.S. Grant Hotel in his honor. There's also a 3-part miniseries going on right now on the History Channel about Ulysses S. Grant, if you're interested. Theodore Roosevelt, colonel in the U.S. Army in Spanish-American War. He was a Medal of Honor winner, or not winner, excuse me, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. But he was a statesman and a laureate, and he helped save some of our land. We have over 200 million acres of national forest and park land, thanks to him and his foresight. But his famous quote was, "Speak softly and carry a big stick and you'll go far." There is an aircraft carrier number 71 that's named for him, and they call it the Big Stick. Harry S. Truman, he was a colonel in the U.S. Army in World War I. He was the 33rd president, and his middle initial stands for both his granddads. He was also a pianist, but not a very good one. And once he returned from Europe, he spoke at a Missouri county fair, and he said, "When I played this, Stalin signed the Potsdam Agreement." So, meaning he wasn't very good. But at the age of 21 is when he enlisted. He was discharged and then came back at the age of 33 to be in World War I. His famous quote, anybody know what his famous quote was? "The buck stops here." He also has an aircraft carrier named for him, number 75, and that ship's call sign is the Lone Warrior. Dwight Eisenhower, of course, you all know about him, and he was a 5-star general in the Army. He's also our 34th president, and he rose up to, by 1917, he was lieutenant colonel, and then by 1942, he was commanding general of the European theater. So his main, what he did was the Battle of Normandy, and he was a very smart man, a very methodical, and operations was what he was known for, and his extensive planning. And so that Battle of Normandy was one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history. He was also a painter, just in case you didn't know that. He didn't start painting until the age of 58, and he completed more than 300 original works of art over his lifetime. And then we have Gerald Ford. He was a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, World War II. He was our 38th president. And then we have, he was an Eagle Scout, and he also had an aircraft carrier named for him, number 78. So his aircraft carrier commission in 2017 was the first of the Gerald R. Ford class. So there's no longer the Nimitz class. They're all now the Gerald R. Ford class. But he was an Eagle Scout, and he used to be a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. And then we have Ronald Reagan, second lieutenant, U.S. Army, and then a captain in the U.S. Army Air Forces, World War II. And he was our 40th president. And he was ordered to active duty in 1942, but due to some eyesight difficulties, he was classified for limited service only, which excluded him from going overseas. So instead, he started working with production companies, and he and his units produced more than 400 training films for the Army Air Force. He also, a little trivia, he signed Major Clark Gable's discharge papers back in 1944. Is an aircraft carrier named for him, number 76, that was stationed in San Diego for several years, and now it's in Japan, but it's Peace Through Strength, and it was commissioned in 2003. One interesting thing, when he was president, he announced that he used these. And I want you in the chat section to try to guess what it was that once he said he used these, the sales of them went up 50%. So he was a good spokesperson for something, and what was that? So I'll be curious what you put in the chat section, and then after this is all over, I'll see if anybody guessed right. And then we have some of the entertainers. Bob Hope, as you know, Bob Hope was described by the Guinness Book of World Records as being the most honored entertainer ever. He received more than 2,000 awards, including 54 honorary doctorates. 1946, he was presented the Medal of Merit by General Eisenhower. And then President Kennedy presented him with a Congressional Gold Medal. President Johnson honored him with a Medal of Freedom, and President Clinton bestowed him the Medal of the Arts. And in 1997, Congress made Bob Hope the very first honorary veteran of the United States. He's the first individual ever to do so. So although he was not in the military per se, he certainly put himself in harm's way. For more than 50 years, he entertained men and women on his USO shows. They figure that at least 10 million GIs saw him. And I don't know if anybody in our audience happened to see him. I've met a few people, but that would have been something. So anyway, thank you, Bob Hope. And his first USO show was back, I think it was 1942, over at March Air Force Base, which is just 100 miles or so from San Diego. Another entertainer during that time was Glenn Miller, Alton Glenn Miller. He was a major in the U.S. Army, and he was a band director. He actually had his own band in 1938, and then gave up everything to enlist in the Navy. The Navy turned him down, so he enlisted in the Army, and they said, yes, we will happily take you. When Eisenhower heard that Glenn Miller had signed up, he immediately said he wanted Miller's band to be the American band of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. And he wanted him to go around and entertain the troops, just like Bob Hope did, and bring up the morale of everybody. So that is what he did. He was actually promoted to major in August of 1944, and just a few months later in December, he was on a flight on a transport plane where he wasn't in the manifest. It was just something to get him to his next place. And anyway, the plane crashed. So he's officially missing in action at that time, and they announced it on Christmas Eve in 1944. So the band continued on, though. They made over 300 personal appearances and played for more than 1.2 million military there in Europe. And then just this one last kind of entertainer, I'd say, was Bill Malden. He was the one that drew the cartoons. Those of you that may remember, he drew Willie and Joe. And his cartoons were picked up by civilian newspapers in the United States. And it was a way that Americans at home could kind of get a better understanding of the day-to-day life of an infantryman. He did receive 2 Pulitzer Prizes. His cartoon was called Star Spangled Banter. And Willie and Joe just lived through all sorts of different situations. In 1960, when he was back after the war, he started working for the Chicago Sun-Times. And some people may remember that he did a cartoon of the statue of Abraham Lincoln that sits in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. He was slumped over in grief and cradling his head in his hands. And that was the day after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, if you remember that. But anyway, so that was him. He also had a stamp made for him commemorating him and Willie and Joe. And that's the picture that I have right there. Then we have Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier ever. That's what they say. Let's go move over here. So he was 21 years old when World War II ended, but by that time he had killed 240 German soldiers. He had been wounded 3 times and had earned 33 awards and medals, including 3 Purple Hearts and the Medal of Honor. And in fact, he received the Medal of Honor at the age of 19 years old, which just amazes me. When he came back, his photograph appeared on the cover of Life magazine, and the actor James Cagney persuaded him to get into acting. So he made more than 40 films, and he retired from acting after 21 years and got into horse racing and all that. But turns out that he did suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder throughout his life. He had some tough times, and he ended up dying in a plane crash in 1971. And he's buried at Arlington, and I've got a picture there. He was given full military honors. But look at all of those medals that he's got there, just at the young age of 21. And then somebody else that you may not even realize, but Jimmy Stewart. He was a pilot. He was a brigadier general, which is 1 star of the U.S. Air Force in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He was in many different wars. In 1941 is when he was drafted into the United States Armed Forces, and he was assigned to the Army Air Corps, stationed at Moffett Field. So he learned about the B-17 aircraft, and he flew those in the training school, and then he began flying combat missions in 1944, and he ended the war with 20 combat missions and remained in the United States Air Force Reserve until 1968, and he was then promoted to a brigadier general in 1959. So Jimmy Stewart, he was a very humble man, wasn't he? I'll always remember him on the Johnny Carson show reading a poem about his dog. And then they even have a plaque of Sir Winston Churchill. And he was the very first person to be recognized as an honorary citizen of the United States. And his famous quote was, "Never, never, never give up." Wally Schirra, he was a local. He was a captain in the U.S. Navy and World War II and Korea. So he fought in 3 wars. And just at the end of World War II, fought in 2 wars, excuse me. But he was, of course, as you know, an astronaut, and he's the only astronaut to fly in all 3 of the early United States crewed space flight programs, the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. And he started flying at the age of 13, and when he enlisted, He said, this is what they say as he told it: 4 significant events occurred in the Western Pacific in August 1945. In chronological order, they are the A-bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, my arrival in the theater, and Japan's surrender. He was 23 years old when he said that. But he flew 90 missions in the Korean War, and of course, he was a test pilot there. And then another local, Ted Williams. He was a captain in the U.S. Marines for World War II and also Korea. And he flew 39 missions and was hit by enemy gunfire on at least 3 different occasions. He also played baseball. So he started here in San Diego at Lane Field and went on to play for the Red Sox. But they say that, little unknown fact there, he is known for hitting the longest ball in history when he was playing at Lane Field, which was over not too far from our train station. And he hit a ball which ended up in an open train that was heading for Los Angeles. So it went about 120 miles. Longest ball in history. And then Cliff Robertson, another local, born and raised in La Jolla. He went on to act, but he's got his plaque up there as well. And then Glenn William Bell Jr., he was a corporal in the U.S. Marines in World War II. And I don't know if you recognize his name. He was from San Bernardino, but he went on to open up Taco Bell. They started with hamburger stands and then, okay, and then I've got just a little bit about Jackie Cochran. Those of you that are in the military will have definitely heard of her. She was a colonel in the U.S. Air Force in World War II. And she was an aviation pioneer and record setter. She was the first woman to pilot a jet across the Atlantic Ocean. She was the first woman to break the sound barrier in 1953. She's also the first woman to take off from an aircraft carrier. Her career culminated with more speed, altitude, and distance records than any other pilot in the world, male or female. Her closest competitor probably would have been Chuck Yeager back then, but she went quite far. She had a real tough beginning. She was born as Bessie Pittman and grew up in poverty. She didn't make it past 2nd grade. In 1920, when she was just 14, she got pregnant and she got married. And she had a son who died about 4 years later. She got divorced. And she was a very pretty woman, so she trained as a beautician and changed her name to Jacqueline or Jackie. Let me just go on. Sorry, let me just mute everybody again. All right, sorry about that. And anyway, and she started her own makeup company, and it was called Wings. She did end up meeting a gentleman by the name of Floyd Odlum, who was one of the 10 richest men in the world, and they got married in 1936. So he really helped her career as far as selling cosmetics. In fact, he got Marilyn Monroe to endorse one of her products. But she entered the military. She took her first flying lessons in 1932, got her pilot's license in 3 weeks. She studied right here in San Diego. And then she went on to go to Britain, and she was there as a bomber pilot and a flight captain for the British Air Transport Auxiliary. And then she came back and was named director of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, which we know as WASP. And that supplied more than 1,000 auxiliary pilots for the armed forces. And apparently she wrote several letters to try to get that passed through, because she realized there were many women out there that could really help with the forces. In 1945, she became the very first woman civilian to be awarded the Distinguished Service Medal and the Distinguished Flying Cross. 1964, she flew an aircraft faster than any woman had in the past. So she just had all sorts of records that she set, and also other honors. She was inducted to the International Aerospace Hall of Fame, the National Aviation Hall of Fame, the Motorsports Hall of Fame. She even has a crater named for her on the planet Venus, and they did a commemorative postage stamp for her, and there is an airport that is named for her over there near Indio, where she lived and where she died. So anyway, thank you, Jackie Cochran, for paving the way for women to come. So this next person, this is John Peck, a technician in the U.S. Army, World War II. And I wanted to bring along a speaker, his daughter, Debbie Schroeder. And Debbie Schroeder, I know her from traveling with Day Tripper Tours. And when she mentioned that her dad had a plaque up here, I thought it would be great to have her talk a little bit, not only about her dad, but also about how she went about to get a plaque. So Debbie, are you out there?
I am. Thank you, Keri.
All right, great. Here. So take it away.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Debbie Schroeder, and I live just down the road, about 5 minutes, actually, from the memorial on Soledad Mountain Road. My husband and I moved here from Chicago in 1998. And when we discovered the cross and the memorial site, we were very impressed. We had my father's plaque put up in 2003, but a little bit about my father and his service. My dad joined the Army in August of 1942, and after basic training was shipped overseas, mainly spent most of his time in Italy. He served in the 182nd Engineer Combat Division. It's an engineering regiment, and mainly what they did was operate very large construction equipment to build or to rebuild roads, bridges, etc. My father mainly operated bulldozers, and I have been told by several veterans that this was a very dangerous and vulnerable job because you were up high in the air and you were an easy target. Many did not survive that were in those positions, and my dad saw others shot or killed. And one of the soldiers close to Dad on another bulldozer was shot, and the bullet grazed my father, but he was okay. He spent the majority, as I said, of his time in Italy. He was in 5 major campaigns, starting in the south of Italy, Naples, Pisa, working their way up to Rome. Rome was liberated in the summer of 1944. So then my dad was put on a ship to head to Japan. And as they were sailing over, Japan surrendered. So they turned the ship around and returned to the US through New York. World War II ended September 2nd, 1945. My father was discharged on October 13th, 1945. He was honored with 4 medals, including the Good Conduct Medal, which I'm actually wearing, but I don't know if you can see me yet. After going home, he went to Chicago, which is where my mother lived, and they were married in Chicago on December 1st, 1945. They were married for 59 years. As I mentioned, my father's plaque went up in 2003. My father passed away in 2004, and he was buried in Columbus, Ohio, which is where I grew up. So my dad was never in San Diego the last year of his life to be able to visit the memorial. But my mother lived 7 years longer, and she was here many times and visited the memorial and Dad's plaque. Now, I often walk over to the memorial and see Dad's plaque. Because he's buried in Ohio, it gives me great gratification to visit his plaque. I also love it that he's on the top row of his wall, so I can place flowers on top of his plaque. It's a wonderful and educational memorial, and we should be very proud in San Diego to have it as part of our community.
Thanks, Debbie. Hey, I wanted to ask you, were you able to choose the location for his plaque?
Well, that's kind of a funny story, because what happens is after they make the plaque, you approve it, the final approval, you see it down in their office in La Jolla. And once you okay it, they tell you it'll be going up. And so with his, we approved it, and they try to hold a couple plaques so that, you know, the fellow that installs them doesn't go up there for every single plaque. And so I was kind of keeping an eye out, because they told me it'll probably be next week. We've had several other plaques we want to put up. So I drive by there anyway on the way down to 52 or to La Jolla, but I kind of was keeping an eye out. And one day I just drove up there and I saw a fellow, looked like he was installing the plaques. And so I got out of the car and went over and talked to him, and I said, "Are you installing them?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you happen to have my father's?" And he said, "Well, let me look." And I gave him his name, John Pack. And he found it and he said, "Yes, I have it." And I said, "Great." And he said, "Well, is there anywhere in particular you would like it to be?" And at that time, 2003, there weren't nearly as many as there are now. So I said, "Well, yes, let me look around." And then I picked wall E, and which is the top row in the front. He faces the ocean and he's on the top row of that wall. So like I said, I can put things on top of his plaque. So that was pretty exciting for me.
That's pretty neat. Yeah, I know. I don't think that normally people can dictate where they want it to go. And then the other question for you, was it hard, like to figure out all the paperwork and, you know, what you needed in order to get that plaque made?
Basically what you do, you fill out the application, you decide, I think you mentioned there are 3 sizes of plaques. We selected the middle size, my family and I, and then they get in contact with you from the Mount Soledad Association, and they kind of tell you, try to gather up as much as you can. A lot of people their person may be gone. My father was alive, so we could still speak with him, but he had quite a bit of information that we could gather up. And my mother remembered a lot. And so it's really wonderful because what they do is they try to pair you. You go into the office and select your photo and then take the information, and they try to pair you with a volunteer who, in this particular instance, was a World War II veteran, which is getting a little tougher nowadays. And so he knew a lot about World War II and my father, where he had been, but he also knew a lot about the position that my father held in the bulldozer and told us how dangerous that was and how lucky we were that he came back. And then after that, they make the plaque so that you can come down and look at first the written version of it, the layout, and then if you approve it, then they make the real plaque and they have you come in and look at the real plaque, and then that's it, and they put it up for you. So it's very easy.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you, Debbie, so much. I really appreciate you taking some time to come and tell us that.
Yes, thank you.
All righty. And then there was one other person that travels a lot. I know her personally from traveling with Day Tripper Tours, and her husband, she put up a plaque for him, Vincent Maracchio. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to speak today, but her husband was a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps in Korea. So Vinny, this one's for you. And then I just thought I'd mention a few of the families. So this is the Salgado family of father and 7 sons. Then we have the Van Sant family of father and 8 sons, but nothing will top this family. This is the Hopkins family of 11 brothers that served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. So I'll just tell you who they are. And anyway, their sister is the one who got their plaques in 2011. They had a ceremony. So you've got Gerald right there. He was in the U.S. Army Air Corps World War II. And then Mark, who was in the Navy in Korea. And then you have Anthony, who was in the Navy during the Cold War. And then you have Jesse. And then he was in the Air Force Reserve, and Quentin, who was a gunner's mate in the U.S. Navy World War II. And then Robert right there. Robert was in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and he was a German POW for 9 months. He was shot down in France. He did get a Purple Heart for that. And then we have another brother, which is Lloyd right there. He was in the Army in World War II. He earned a Bronze Star, and he left a professional baseball career to serve in the military. He landed on Omaha on D-Day. And then we have Richard, who was in the U.S. Army Air Corps World War II, and then David, who was in the U.S. Navy World War II. And he also flew the Catalinas, which were made right here in San Diego. And then we've got Rex, who was a sergeant in the Army Air Corps, World War II. And then last but not least, we have Ralph, who was a technical sergeant in the U.S. Army World War II. So what a family. And their sister is the one who decided to have a ceremony. So they were not all there, but some had passed away by then. But anyways, at least representatives of family or the living brothers were there for that ceremony. Then I'm also adding just a couple couples here, because you can also do a plaque that way. And so I don't know really anything about these people other than I thought it was neat that they were sharing plaques here. So there's a couple of there. Now here is a story about Miles Cables. He was a sergeant first class in the Army for World War II in Korea. But what's important about him is that he was in the Bataan Death March, and he was also a POW. He, in April of 1942, is when the Bataan Death March happened. There were 76,000 prisoners of war. 66,000 of those were Filipinos, and the rest were Americans. And they were forced by the Japanese military to march 66 miles in extreme heat and terrible conditions to get to POW camps. And during that march, they would have groups of about 100 at a time. It would take 5 to 10 days to complete that. And they don't know exact figures, but thousands died on the way to the camps during that march. Mainly because of the brutality of their Japanese captors who would beat them and bayonet them. And then when they arrived at the prisoner of war camps, many more died from disease and starvation and mistreatment. So they figured about 30% of those died. It was the largest army under American command ever to surrender. And finally, in 1945, under the direction of MacArthur, the U.S. Philippine forces recaptured the Bataan Peninsula, and it was liberated in early March. But that was some tough times. And then after that, he went back and he was in the Korean War, and he was a prisoner of war there for 5 months. So that man experienced some true hard times. Louis Zamperini is another prisoner of war, and he was a prisoner of war for a couple of years. I think most people know him because of the story that was told in the movie that was made about him back in 2014 called Unbroken, and that was based on a book. But he had been in the Olympics. They were canceled, so he enlisted into the Army, and he flew the B-24 Liberators. And while he was out on a mission, their plane had mechanical failure and it crashed. And of the 11 men on board, only 3 of them survived. And they were stranded on a raft for 47 harrowing days. They had to worry about the Japanese. They had to worry about circling sharks and the fact that they didn't have much water to drink. So they were able to collect rainwater and kill birds that happened to land on the raft. And that's how they survived for 47 days. And they drifted 2,000 miles in those 47 days, and they ended up on a Pacific island that was an enemy Japanese territory, where they were then taken as prisoner of war. And he was singled out and abused repeatedly by a camp sergeant called the Bird, if you remember that in the movie. Anyway, he was in captivity for a little more than 2 years. He was actually pronounced dead by the US military. They had no idea. It was only after the war ended. And he returned to the United States that they knew that he was alive. He actually forgave his Japanese tormentors, some in 1950 when he visited Tokyo, and then again in 1998 when he returned. He carried the torch at the Nagano Winter Games, if you remember that. And he also wanted to meet up with the Bird, who was Mutsuhiro Watanabe, but he refused to meet with him. So anyway, that movie in 2014 was very successful. He ended up dying at the age of 97 in 2014, and he had been asked that year if he would be the Grand Marshal at the Pasadena Tournament of Roses parade. And unfortunately, he died before the parade, but they still had him as a Grand Marshal, and his family was able to attend on his behalf and drive down the 5-mile parade route. And then we have Gregory Pappy Boynton, and he was part of the Flying Tigers. He also had a Medal of Honor and a Red Cross. but he was pretty rambunctious and he was quite the drinker apparently. And he says that his 20 months as a POW probably led to a longer life for him because he couldn't drink. So he does say that that was the positive of that. There was a TV show in 1976 through 78 with Robert Conrad called Baa Black Sheep. If you remember, that was about Pappy Boynton. And then James Stockdale, Vice Admiral of the Navy and Korea and Vietnam. He was a POW from 1965 to 1963. And he flew over 200 missions before he was shot down in 1965. He was the highest ranking naval officer held as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. And he was awarded 26 personal combat decorations, including the Medal of Honor. And he also received 4 Silver Stars. He was also, you might remember, the vice president candidate for Ross Perot back in 1992. And then here is the very first Medal of Honor recipient in the Vietnam War, Roger Donlin, and he helped save many lives when there was an attack in Vietnam of his crew, and there was barrage of mortar shells and grenades, and heavy gunfire lasted 5 hours, and he risked his life several times. So he got the Medal of Honor by President Lyndon B. Johnson, and all 9 survivors were there. And he said the medal belongs to all of them. Here's another local guy, John Baca. He got the Medal of Honor. And that was back in 1970 in Vietnam when somebody, the enemy had thrown a live grenade. And so he threw his helmet over it and then he laid on that and it exploded and his body absorbed the full impact. He was able to save 8 fellow soldiers that way. He survived his wounds and he was awarded the Medal of Honor by Richard Nixon in 1971. And he lives in La Jolla and he can be seen on the grassy area over there of Mount Soledad flying kites if you ever go there. Nice story about Lori Paestua. She was killed in action in 2003 at the age of 23. She is the first Native American woman in history to die in combat while serving in the military, and the first woman in the US military that was killed in the Iraq War. She was awarded the Purple Heart and the Prisoner of War Medal. She was a member of the Hopi tribe, and the Hopi tribe and the Navajo actually met in a rare joint prayer, and which was not something they did often because they have a centuries-old rivalry. But you might remember her because that was the same year that Jessica Lynch was kidnapped, or not kidnapped, but a prisoner of war. So they were in the same Humvee when it was ambushed, and they ended up running into the rear of a disabled tractor trailer, and several were killed, but she and Jessica lived. They were taken prisoner. She died a little bit later that day after a video was made. But Jessica ended up being rescued by the U.S. Special Operations Forces. It was the first successful rescue of an American POW since World War II. That was after 9 days. So anyway, but you might remember the Extreme Makeover Home Edition. She was one of the first recipients, or her family was, of a brand new house, and that was back in 2005. And also in Arizona, over there near Scottsdale, there is a mountain named after her. It's called Paestua Peak. And here is Dory Miller, and some of you may have heard of him. He was recognized as one of the first heroes of World War II. And he was at Pearl Harbor when their ship was struck and it was starting to sink. And so he was able to lift people up. He was a rather large man. He lifted them up and brought many of them to safety. And then he came back and he grabbed a 50 caliber anti-craft gun and shot at the Japanese. He had no training on it, and he continued firing until he ran out of ammunition. He received an order to abandon ship. But anyway, his actions earned him the Navy Cross, and you can see in this picture here that it's being pinned on him personally by Commander Nimitz. He was commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and that was 1942. Unfortunately, died a year later when a torpedo sank his escort carrier, the Liscombe Bay. 1973, frigate was commissioned and named in his honor. And then in 2030, there is going to be an aircraft carrier named for him, number 81. It'll be the 4th carrier in the Ford class of carriers. So anyway, it'll be the first aircraft carrier in the history of the U.S. Navy that was named and honoring not only Dory for what he did, but also his contributions as just an enlisted sailor, not as a president or a general or anything. And it also will be named to honor the contributions of African-American sailors. In the 2001 Pearl Harbor movie, he was played by Cuba Gooding Jr. Here is Nathan Kristoff, and I have him up here because he was killed in action in 2006. He was 25 years old, received the Purple Heart, but his dad decided to leave his orthopedic practice and a comfortable life, and to honor his son, he joined the Navy as a combat surgeon in 2007, just a year after his son was killed. Here's another local man, Kenton James Stacy, and he served in the Navy as an explosive ordnance disposal technician in more than 50 combat missions. He completed 1 tour in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan, and he was severely wounded in November of 2017 by an IED explosion as he and his team were clearing a hospital in an area that had been occupied by the ISIS militants. So they had a ceremony for him in 2019 when they put up his plaque. Unfortunately, he is now in a wheelchair, but he served over 50 combat missions. And then here's another local. This is Wimbo in Cairo, and Wimbo is what he's known for, or his name, but he's technically Lloyd Wimberly, but they called him Wimbo. And his canine is multi-purpose canine by the name of Cairo, and he says that he owes his life to his Belgian Malinois, and they both live over in San Diego, close by. And he decided he wanted to get a plaque in 2016, so he went and started a GoFundMe page, and he was able to raise $1,800 in just one day. And they said it was quite a ceremony there, and there was a lot of Navy SEALs that attended that ceremony, but they were not dressed in uniforms, so you didn't know that they were the Navy SEALs. And then I'm just going to end it here, and I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over, but I'm going to end it with Daniel Doc Jacobs. He was a hospital corpsman, 2nd class in the U.S. Navy in Iraq, and he earned a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. But in 2005, he was hit by an IED explosion, his truck was, and he lost his left leg below the knee. He lost 3 toes on his right foot and parts of 3 fingers from his left hand. But he continued on in the military. In fact, he had 235 combat patrols, and he is the first ever amputee corpsman and all of Navy personnel to ever be assigned to an infantry unit as an amputee. He retired from the Navy in 2012 after serving 8 years. And now I'm going to fast forward to just last year in November. Believe it or not, he was training to summit Mount Kilimanjaro. He had tried it a few years before, didn't quite make it because of altitude sickness, so he decided to do it again in 2019, or actually this year, 2020, but he started training in 2019. While he was training, he heard that a friend of his needed a kidney. So he volunteered to donate his kidney. His friend couldn't take it. They weren't a match, but somebody else was. So he donated a kidney to a random person. And then in March of 2020, so just 4 months later, he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And I just find that amazing. He has a foundation. It is called the Doc Jacobs Foundation, which helps active military and veteran families pay for sports programs for their children. So I wanted to end it on that note, but I still have a few more things to show. While I was wandering around a couple of weeks ago, you can see in my reflection, I'm talking to someone, and that is one of the artists of the engravings. That's Chris, and she engraved that plaque, and she was the one that told me a few of the stories that I shared with you today. But she said that she loves doing those plaques, and she loves researching some of these people that maybe don't have that much information. She'll go into the military archives and try to put more information on the plaques. I mentioned that I was going to share some of the information to you about getting the plaques. The plaques start at $950. They go up to $800. There are 3 different sizes. They are tax deductible, and there's a phone number written there you can call. Or you can go to soledadmemorial.org and search from there. You do have to have the honorable discharge paperwork, which is called the DD-214, and you have to have that in order to get one of the plaques. And you can obtain that record by going to the archives.org website, and it will tell you how to further get that. But as I mentioned earlier, it's much easier to get it when the veteran is alive. So if any of you are thinking of doing that, do it sooner than later. And then I just wanted to put up this picture I took, I thought was pretty good, of Mount Soledad and its cross. And here are just a few shots. There's the artist again talking. And then here you can see just a few panoramic views of these. So again, there's 5,500. They figure they're probably going to run out in the next 3 to 5 years of space. They have a little more space to add some more walls, but then that's it. We do take bus tours up there, so I miss doing that, but we're able to drive up there, circle around and park and let people get out. We bring tour groups, we bring military groups, we bring students. I've got a little group of students here. As I mentioned, it's also a great place to come when the sun is setting. So I've got that. I did want to give a big shout out to Debbie and her dad, John Pack. Thank you very much, Debbie, for talking with us today. I'm also going to just scroll through, and these are going to be really quick, but I have some information because when I was doing the research, I didn't know anything. I am certainly not a military historian, so I had to look up about the different crosses and also the different military ranks. So I'm just going to go through those quickly, so if you see it later on the YouTube and you want to stop and look, you can. But these are just the military ranks for the Army, and for the Navy, and the Marines, and the Coast Guard, and the Air Force. And then I have some of the medals. The Medal of Honor, that's the top medal to get, and that is bestowed on you by a president. And then next in line is the Distinguished Service Cross. And then they've got the Navy Cross, the Air Force Cross, and then the Silver Star. And then last we have the Purple Heart. The Purple Heart started back when George Washington was a general, and that's why his image is on that. So I wanted to thank everybody for taking more time than I had anticipated to see this presentation, and I hope that this will inspire you to make your way to Mount Soledad. If you want a personal guide, I'm happy to take you up there. But once you're up there and you're seeing all the plaques and touching them and just reading about all the people that lost their lives or didn't, but all the veterans that are there, it makes you just so proud to be an American and know that people fought for our freedom. So I want to thank everybody for that.